All right, welcome back to Chapter 8, Part 2. We are actually going to get to experience the Quidditch World Cup today. With a sharp blast of his whistle, Mustafa shot off into the air after the balls. "They're off!" screamed Bagman. "And it's Mullet, Troy, Moran, Dimitrov, back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Moran." It was Quidditch as Harry had never seen it played before. He was pressing his omnioculars so hard to his eyes that his glasses were cutting into the bridge of his nose. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to each other so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Harry spun the slow dial on the right of his omnioculars again, pressed the play-by-play button on the top, and he was immediately watching in slow motion, while glittering purple letters flashed across the lenses, and the noise of the crowd pounded against his eardrums. "Hawkshead attacking formation," he read, as he watched the three Irish chasers zoom closely together, Troy in the center, slightly ahead of Mullet and Moran, bearing down upon the Bulgarians. The Porskoff ploy flashed up next, as Troy made as to dart upwards with the quaffle, drawing away the Bulgarian chaser Isanova and dropping the quaffle to Moran. One of the Bulgarian beaters, Volkov, swung hard at a passing bludger with his small club, knocking it into Moran's path. Moran ducked to avoid the bludger and dropped the quaffle. Levski, soaring beneath it, caught it. "Troy scores!" roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with the roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 to Ireland. "What?" Harry yelled, looking around wildly through his omnioculars. "But Levski's got the quaffle." "Harry, if you're not going to watch at normal speed, you're going to miss things," shouted Hermione, who was dancing up and down, waving her arms in the air while Troy did a lap of honor in the pitch. Harry looked quickly over the top of his omnioculars and saw that the leprechauns watching from the sidelines had all risen into the air again and formed the great glittering shamrock. Across the pitch, the Vila were watching them sulkily. Furious with himself, Harry spun his speed dial back to normal as play resumed. Harry knew enough about Quidditch to see that the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, appearing to read each other's minds by the way they positioned themselves. And the rosette on Harry's chest kept squeaking their names. "Troy! Mullet! Moran!" And within 10 minutes Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead 30-0, and causing a thunderous tide of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. The match became still faster, but more brutal. Volkov and Volkanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were now whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then finally, Ivanova managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper, Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Fingers in your ears," bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila started to dance in celebration. Harry screwed up his eyes too. He wanted to keep his mind on the game. After a few seconds, he chanced to glance at the pitch. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria were again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova, oh, I say!" roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards and witches gasped as the two seekers, Crumb and Lynch, plummeted through the center of the chasers so fast it looked as though they had just jumped from aeroplanes without parachutes. Harry followed their descent through his omnioculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash!" screamed Hermione next to Harry. She was half right. At the very last second, Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiraled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Fool!" moaned Mr. Weasley. "Crumb was fainting." "It's time out!" yelled Bagman's voice, as trained Medi-Wizards hurry onto the pitch to examine Aiden Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got plowed," Charlie said reassuringly to Ginny, who was hanging over the side of the box, looking horror-struck. Which is what Crumb was after, of course. Harry hastily pressed the replay button and play-by-play buttons on his omnioculars, twiddled the speed dial, and then put them back up to his eyes. He watched as Crumb and Lynch dived again in slow motion. "The Wronski feint, dangerous seeker diversion," read the shining purple lettering across his lenses. He saw Crumb's face contorted with concentration as he pulled out of the dive just in time, while Lynch was flattened, and he understood. Crumb hadn't seen the snitch at all. He was just making Lynch copy him. Harry had never seen anyone fly like that. Crumb hardly looked as though he was using a broomstick at all. He moved so easily through the air that it looked as though he was unsupported and weightless. Harry turned his omnioculars back to normal and focused them on Crumb. He was circling high over Lynch, who was now being revived by Mediwizards with cups of potion. Harry, focusing still more closely on Crumb's face, saw his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time while Lynch was revived to look for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his firebolt, and kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland new heart. When Mustapha blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with a skill unrivaled by anything Harry had ever seen so far. After 15 more fast and furious minutes, Ireland had pulled ahead by 10 more goals. They were now leading by 130 points to 10, and the game was starting to get dirtier. As Mullet shot towards the goalposts, yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm, the Bulgarian keeper Zagrov flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly Harry didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd and Mustapha's long, shrill whistle blast told him it had been a foul. And Mustapha takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for cobbing, excessive use of elbows, Bagman informed the roaring spectators. And yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words ha ha ha. The Vila on the other side of the pitch leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. As one, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers in their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his finger impatiently out of his ears. Look at the referee, she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the pitch. Hassan Mustapha was landing right in front of the dancing Vila and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles, smoothing his mustache excitedly. Now, we can't have that, said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. Someone slapped the referee. A Mediwizard came tearing across the pitch, his fingers stuffed in his own ears, and kicked Mustapha hard on the shins. Mustapha seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through his omnioculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed, and was shouting at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. And unless I'm mistaken, Mustapha is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots, said Bagman's voice. Now there is something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty. It did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volkanov, had landed on either side of Mustapha and had began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating towards the leprechauns, who now gleefully formed the words, he, he. Mustapha was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his fingers into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again. When they refused, they got 2 short blasts from his whistle. 2 penalties for Ireland, shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. And Volkov and Volkanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go, and Troy takes the quaffle. Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volkanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with bludgers or humans, as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. Foul! Roared the Irish supporters at once, all standing up in a great wave of green. Foul! Echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. Dimitrov skins Moran, deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty. Yes, there's the whistle. The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed, across the pitch towards the Vila. At this, the Vila lost control. They launched themselves across the pitch and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his omnioculars, Harry saw that they did not look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongating into sharp, cruel, beak-like bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. Here we have a snapshot from one of the rounds. And that, boys, yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, is why you should never go for looks alone. Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the Leprechauns, but with little success. Meanwhile, the pitched battle below had nothing to do with the one above. Harry turned his way this way and that, staring through his omnioculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Moran, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Moran again, Moran scores! But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila. The blast now issuing from Ministry members' wands and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov. The Irish beater Quigley swung heavily at a passing bludger and hit it as hard as possible towards Crum, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him hard in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crum's nose looked broken. There was blood everywhere. But Hassan Mustafa didn't blow his whistle. He had become distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broomtail alight. Harry wanted someone to realize that Crum was injured, even though he was supporting Ireland. Crum was the most exciting player on the pitch. Ron obviously felt the same. Time out! Oh, come on! He can't play like that! Look at him! Look at Lynch! Harry yelled. For the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Harry was quite sure that this was no Wronski feint. This was the real thing. He's seen the snitch, Harry shouted. He's seen it. Look at him go. Half the crowd seemed to have realized what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in a great wave of green, screaming their seeker on, but Crum was on his tail. How he could see where he was going, Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch now as a pair of them hurtled towards the ground again. They're gonna crash, shrieked Hermione. They're not, roared Ron. Lynch is, yelled Harry. And he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force, and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Vila. The snitch! Where's the snitch? Bellowed Charlie along the row. He's got it! Crum's got it! It's all over! Shouted Harry. Crum, his red robe shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing. Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170. Across the crowd, which didn't seem to have realized what had happened. Then slowly, as though a great jumbo jet was revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and louder and erupted into screams of delight. Ireland wins! Shouted Bagman, who, like the Irish, seemed to have been taken aback by the sudden end of the match. Crum gets the snitch, but Ireland wins! Good Lord, I don't think any of us were expecting that. What did he catch the snitch for? Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. He ended it when Ireland were only 160 points ahead, the idiot. He knew they were never going to catch up, Harry shouted back over all the noise, also applauding loudly. The Irish chasers were too good. He wanted to end it on his terms, that's all. He was very brave, wasn't he? Hermione said, leaning forward to watch Crum land, and a swarm of Medi-Wizards blasting a path through the battling leprechauns and Vila to get to him. He looks like a terrible mess. Harry put his omnioculars to his eyes again. It was hard to see what was happening below because leprechauns were zooming delightedly all over the pitch, but he could make out Crum surrounded by Medi-Wizards. He looked surlier than ever and refused to let them mop him up. His teammates were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully in a shower of gold descending from their mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium. The Irish national anthem blared from all sides. The Vila were shrinking back into their usual beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. Well, we fought bravely, said a gloomy voice behind Harry. He looked around. It was the Bulgarian Minister of Magic. You can speak English? Said Fudge, sounding outraged. And you've been letting me mime everything all day? Well, it was very funny, said the Bulgarian minister, shrugging. And as the Irish team perform a lap of honor flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box, roared Bagman. Harry's eyes were suddenly dazzled by a blinding white light as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see the inside. Squinting towards the entrance, he saw two panting wizards carrying into the box a vast gold cup, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was still looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers. Bulgaria! Bagman shouted. And up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgaria players. The crowd below were applauding appreciatively. Harry could see thousands and thousands of omniocular lenses flashing and winking in their direction. One by one, the Bulgarians filed between the rows of seats in the box, and Bagman called out their names of each of them as they shook hands with their own minister and then Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch. Harry noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered, but when Crumb's name was announced, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Aidan Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly. The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused. But he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air, and the crowd below thundered their approval. Harry's hands were numb from clapping. At last, when the Irish team had left the box to perform another lap of honor on their brooms, Aidan Lynch on the back of Connolly's, clutching hard around his waist and still grinning in a bemused sort of way, Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and muttered, "Quietus." "They'll be talking about this one for years," he said hoarsely. "A really unexpected twist. That shame it couldn't have lasted longer. Ah, yes. I owe you how much?" For Fred and George had just scrambled over the backs of their seats and were standing in front of Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces, their hands outstretched. All right, tomorrow we will pick up with Chapter 9, The Dark Mark, and I'll see you then.